Welcome to the inaugural event of the Huntington Lecture Series. We're thrilled that you're able to be with us tonight and particularly be able to begin a conversation in Huntington about issues relating to our city, in some measure giving us an opportunity to discuss what those who are in Huntington and from Huntington are able to change the world, and at the same time offer some food for thought. Today we're extremely pleased as part of Huntington's history to be able to have the inaugural lecture to be regarding the distinguished Dr. Carter G. Goodson. We're so proud of all that he was able to do and what it says about Huntington, and we're certainly looking forward to an interesting lecture this evening. To that end, I'll turn it over to Dr. Alan Gould of Marshall University to be able to come on up and introduce our lecture. Dr. Alan Gould.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir.
Well, good evening. Good evening. Before I begin, I'd like to publicly acknowledge all that our good mayor has done to help us begin our project on Carter G. Woodson. About a year ago, this time, the Drinko Academy held a luncheon, and we invited leaders from Marshall and the community to come and talk about how we could reintroduce this great man to our community. And one of the people who came was our mayor. And during the question and answers part of the program, our mayor came up with many suggestions, 3 of which were very good. The first was to have a celebration at the very beginning so that the people of Huntington could acknowledge and recognize who this man was. So he suggested doing a proclamation day, which we did. He gave his proclamation honoring Woodson and also served as master of ceremonies for a number of other proclamations, resolutions, and tributes given to Dr. Woodson. That was just last Friday. It was a great kickoff to our program. Then on Sunday, Morris Cooley had his annual Soul Food Festival at Marshall, and our mayor came and spoke, read the proclamation, and again extolled the virtues and supported our project. And then thirdly, in his new lectures for Huntington, he selected our own Burnis R as his inaugural speaker. So, Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for all your contributions, and let's give him a big round of applause. Now it's my pleasure to introduce that inaugural speaker. I want to tell you I spent a lot of time working on this introduction because my mama told me that if you can't say anything nice about anybody, don't say anything. So it's going to be brief, Burnis. Mr. Burnis R. Morris hails from Laurel, Mississippi. He's a grad of University of Mississippi with a degree in journalism and holds a master's in public administration from the University of Dayton. As one of the first black journalist students at Ole Miss, he founded a black student newspaper, The Spectator, and was the university's first African-American student selected for Who's Who in American colleges and universities. Among many accolades, Burnis received a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship for Journalists in Modern Fiction from the University of California, Berkeley. And Burnis, I think that was a great tribute. And I personally believe that all American journalists should take a course in modern American fiction. So, good for you. He's also a Freedom Forum First Amendment Scholar, Vanderbilt University, and the first Samuel Talbot Lecturer at the University of Mississippi School of Journalism. Before entering the field of academia, Professor Morris established a highly successful career as a professional journalist, serving on the staff of a number of notable newspapers. He served as an intern in the New York Times and spent 13 years in various reporting, editing, and managerial positions at newspapers, including the Atlanta Constitution, the Austrian American Statesman, the Palm Beach Post, and the Charlotte Observer. Nationally, Professor Morris is also known for his work to improve press coverage of philanthropists and tax-exempt institutions, and has written 2 books and numerous articles about nonprofits. Burnis joined the Marsh community in 2003 as the Dr. Carter G. Woodson Professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications, and has proven to be a valuable member of our faculty in his school, his college, and the university. One example of his many contributions will have to suffice. In 2009, Professor Morris was organized and still directs a summer workshop for outstanding high school journalism students, which was, I might add, generously funded by the Huntington Herald-Dispatch. A number of these select students, including several minorities, have chosen to study journalism here at Marshall. I'm also pleased to announce that in 2011, Professor Morris was appointed as a Distinguished Drinko Fellow at Marshall. And to me, that's his most important accolade. As a Drinko Fellow, Burnis chose as his research topic how Dr. Carter G. Woodson employed Black American press to popularize African American history. Subsequently, owing to his research, Professor Morris has presented papers and chaired sessions at the national meetings of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which Dr. Woodson founded in September 1915. And as a result of his many accomplishments, he's become what I believe to be a truly outstanding national authority on the life, time, and legacy of the great Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And also owing to his research, Burnis was appointed as a Carter G. Woodson Fellow at the prestigious Emory University. And in January 29th of this year, he was honored by the West Virginia History Day celebration at the Capitol in Charleston as a 2016 West Virginia History Hero. Lastly, he's recently completed a manuscript on Woodson, and the United Press of Mississippi has accepted it for publication. I would also suggest that Bernard, in our celebration of Carter G. Woodson this year, has carried the bulk of the load. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you my friend, my colleague, and fellow coordinator of this year's celebrations. Now listen to this. The Dr. Carter G. Woodson Professor of Journalism in the W. Page Pitt School of Journalism of Marshall University, Burnis Morris. Did I get everything in there, Burnis?
Yo, you did. Checks in the mail. Thank you, Alan, for the introduction, and I thank all of you for coming out tonight to hear me discuss Carter G. Woodson. Mayor Williams and other distinguished guests, I am delighted to speak tonight at an event honoring Woodson, and I thank the mayor for inviting me to be the first lecturer in this series. Dr. Gould, by the way, has been a driving force behind efforts to honor Dr. Woodson, as well as former Mayor Bobby Nelson, Nawatha Myers, Karen Nance, David Harris of the Woodson Memorial Foundation. As far back as the 1990s, you've been working for this cause. This is such a momentous occasion. 3 days ago, the mayor first proclaimed February 5th as the Dr. Carter G. Woodson Day. Dr. Woodson is finally receiving recognition he deserves from his adopted hometown. Yesterday, many of us attended the annual Soul Food Feast at Marshall and learned that this event is being renamed Dr. Carter G. Woodson Annual Soul Food Feast. Let us show some appreciation to Maurice Cooley and his staff for bringing this about. As a Harvard-trained historian, Dr. Woodson warned readers in his newspaper columns to avoid assigning historical significance to people and events too soon. In one column, he joked, "We should be careful what we wish for in creating black monuments. We might get one in honor of the black mammy." Dr. Woodson had a lot of humor. Dr. Woodson was especially critical of journalistic practices that jumped the gun. However, even speaking as a journalist, I believe waiting 65 years after Dr. Woodson's death is a long time. Waiting 90 years after he received the NAACP Spingarn Award, then regarded as the highest award an African American could receive, is not jumping the gun in celebrating Woodson. He was already being called the father of Negro history before he died. So I believe Dr. Woodson would agree with all of us that it's about time. That is, if Dr. Woodson spoke slang, it's about time. Speaking of slang, I am reminded, as I digress, Dr. Gould, of an incident that got Dr. Woodson fired as dean at Howard University in 1920. The Howard president wanted a book about Marxism removed from the university library. He also wanted Woodson to inform him about faculty attendance at chapel. Dr. Woodson was insubordinate, defiant, during at least one meeting with the president. And he told the president he wasn't worth a continental, which is old school slang, I guess, from the 18th century, meaning he was worth less than face value. Charles Wesley, one of the disciples to whom Woodson told this story, said he asked whether the Howard president understood what Dr. Woodson meant. And Woodson said that the president would have understood coarser language, but he got the message. I'm not much into modern slang either. I don't even cuss, so I have to be emphatic. Since my days as an editor, when I'm mad at reporters, even students, I think of them as typists rather than reporters, and they get the point. Tonight, I will reintroduce Dr. Woodson as a great American hero and proclaim his achievements as worthy of classification among the greatest of the last century. He was born in New Canton, Virginia on December 19, 1875, and died at his Washington, D.C. home office on April 3, 1950, at the age of 74. These dates serve as bookends, and the reason you're here is you want to know what he did in between the bookends. My discussion of Dr. Woodson's life includes this time he spent in Huntington, but I will also examine other important parts of his life and explained why all Americans should honor him. Just think for a moment about conditions for black people in America during the start of the Woodson era, when black lives and culture did not matter. Then consider what happened as a result of Dr. Woodson's crusade to win respect for black people and return them to their rightful places in history books. What Dr. Woodson accomplished is nothing less than a successful, bloodless revolution, one of the great feats of the century. Far from being unarmed, he attacked conventional thinking with great intellect and determination. He transformed the teaching of history and made education more inclusive of African Americans and other minority groups. My comments today are borrowed liberally from my research for a book and an article I was invited to write on Woodson's early years for the History Association he founded in 1915. Memories of Woodson have faded across the country, even in Huntington, since his death, when he was probably the best-known black person in America. I blame Dr. Woodson's unselfish devotion to what he called the cause for so few people knowing much about him. He had a one-track mind about historical research, but he spent little time promoting Carter G. Woodson. He saw success as acceptance of black history by the public. He and his history movement were one and inseparable, but he didn't seek personal gain or promote himself outside his movement. Booker T. Washington will be long remembered because he had Tuskegee Institute as his monument. Frederick Douglass, a mansion high on a hill in Washington, D.C., as his monument. Presidents of the United States have their libraries as monuments, too, all supported by wealthy people or taxpayers. Woodson had wealthy backers for his research only in the 1920s and early 1930s, but their generosity dried up during the Great Depression because of the economic crisis and because of his independent spirit. Powerful people considered Woodson difficult to deal with because he couldn't be controlled. As a result, the history movement he built survived on the pennies ordinary citizens and school children invested in him. Dr. Woodson did not seek his followers' money to build an expensive monument to himself. His gift to us was a gift of empowerment. His frugal lifestyle somehow does not translate well for today's bling society, especially a life before the television age. There was nothing showy about Dr. Woodson. His friends saw his softer side and sense of humor, but his public life was all business. He was charismatic but low-key, committed to his cause 24/7. Dr. Woodson did not play games after he began promoting his cause. As the writer Langston Hughes, then a Woodson research assistant, discovered during the 1920s. Dr. Woodson was away on a business trip and returned unexpectedly to find Langston and others playing cards on Dr. Woodson's dime. To keep this story short, let's just say Langston Hughes said the boss was not amused. Unlike Douglass, Booker T. Washington, and others, Woodson did not write books about himself. He wrote no autobiography. He told us what he wanted us to know about himself in his Library of Congress files and facts buried in newspaper articles. As a professor, he left behind instructions for us to conduct historical research. As good students, we should be able to follow his teachings. So, where did all of these teachings and accomplishments come from? How did some poor black kid become a leading intellectual of the 20th century. Let's examine his beginnings for clues. Dr. Woodson's early years include the time he spent in Huntington and nearby communities, places where he lived, worked, and studied, and where he was acquiring the foundations for the modern Black history movement, the label we give much of his work. Mayor Williams has said on several occasions that Huntington should own this part of the Woodson story, as have others in this room. Their arguments are compelling. Woodson's parents, who were among the city's early residents, and many of his friends and relatives are buried here. Carter Woodson graduated from Douglas School in 1896, returned as principal in 1900, and left in 1903 when he took a job supervising schools in the Philippines. He wrote the history of early Black education in West Virginia and published it in the Journal of Negro History, which he also founded, and school teachers throughout the state strongly supported his movement. His statue is walking distance from campus. The Huntington name is important in Black history. Collis P. Huntington Building served as the main library for Hampton University in the early 1900s to 1992, a school whose alumni include Booker T. Washington, I might add. Hampton and Marshall were sister schools during the Alan Gould era at Marshall. More importantly, Woodson claimed Huntington. I've spent several years analyzing Woodson's work and have yet to find any criticism of Huntington or West Virginia. However, he did not refrain from criticizing the state of Virginia, his home state, as he did as the main speaker at dedication of a shrine honoring Booker T. Washington in 1932. The speech, covered by the New York Times and other newspapers, was delivered in Malden near Charleston. The newspaper reported, quote, Dr. Woodson declared that West Virginia was fortunate in having Washington settled there, and Washington likewise was fortunate in growing up here, in this atmosphere of more liberty than that of the state from which he came, unquote. Dr. Woodson's respect for our section of Virginia does not mean that all white Appalachians loved Black people. He clearly understood the pro-slavery sentiment in Western Virginia and Appalachia, but he also distinguished between pro-slavery on the Atlantic and pro-slavery in the Appalachian Mountains. In A Century of Negro Migration, he wrote, the mountaineers believed in civil liberty, in fee simple, and an open road to civil honors secured to the poorest and feeblest members of society. The Eastern element had for their ideal a government of interest for the people. They believed in liberty, but that of kings, lords, and commons, not of all the people. He concluded that conditions were more favorable to Blacks in West Virginia than in other parts of Virginia and the Old South. In Huntington, he witnessed Blacks and whites making cultural exchanges. He said, Blacks got their emotional outburst in church from white people. For example, he said, on one visit to Huntington, he was at a friend's home and his friends had to call the police because the white church across the street was carrying on so loudly. I told this story a few years back, and the white minister sitting near me leaned over and said it was his church. By now, you must agree that Dr. Woodson's early life and Huntington's early history are intertwined. In fact, we could argue that our community and the state's coal fields supplied significant raw materials that assisted Woodson in establishing the foundation for the history movement. The West Virginia years, however, are the period Woodson scholars and other followers know least and often misunderstand. with ignorance many of the people Woodson first encountered when he was rising to become the intellectual leader of Black America incorrectly prejudged him. A Chicago Defender columnist, for example, suggested Woodson was illiterate as a young adult, mistaking self-taught with illiterate. Howard University professor Kelly Miller, one of the so-called scholarly people Woodson identified as predicting his failure when he revealed his plans for Black history, argued that Woodson arrived to lead the rescue of his race late in life and compared his self-help philosophy to Marcus Garvey's, only distinguishing them derisively by saying Woodson's views were moderated by his Anglo-Saxon education. Woodson didn't suffer fools lightly. He responded saying Miller was, quote, an Uncle Tom type Negro, unquote, and a man of low intellect. That wasn't slang, that was name-calling. American education, when Dr. Woodson was growing up, was filled with white supremacist ideas, and Woodson said he had been taught the same theories of Black inferiority as other students. But he handled this misinformation better than most because he had been well-grounded. Woodson said his parents, James and Ann Eliza, first moved into the area that became Huntington in 1870. One Woodson biographer, Sister Anthony Scally, suggested the Woodsons walked 300 miles from Virginia to Huntington. The family moved back to Virginia in 1874, and Sister Scally speculated they wanted to escape unsanitary living conditions in Huntington and health risks to their 4 living children, having already lost 2 children to whooping cough. Carter Woodson was born the following year on December 19, 1875, near New Canton in Buckingham County, Virginia. Carter said he often left the dinner table hungry and found food in the woods. At times, he said, eating, quote, the sour grass that grew early in spring out of the providence of God, unquote. On Saturday nights, after he went to bed, his mother washed the clothes he wore so he would wear clean clothes to church. Of this period, Woodson explained, quote, it's not a rosy path at all, and sometimes I have to struggle to keep going. But I like it much better than I do the work of a friend of mine who just accepted a job of segregation, paying $500 a month, unquote. Carter Woodson's father, James Woodson, a Civil War veteran who learned carpentry from his father, earned money laying foundations for homes. He said his father was illiterate and intelligent, and he provided him with guiding principles about life, including race relations and the work ethic. Unlike many other Black parents, James Woodson did not hire out his children to supplement family income. And when he had dealings at other people's homes, including white residents, he avoided going to their back doors. Anyone who has seen the movie The Help from a few years ago should recall the significance of the Black housekeeper's daughter going to the white boss's front door. At 12 years old, Carter Woodson read a story in a McGuffey reader involving 2 boys, George Jones and Charles Bullard, with moral religious overtones. The Bullard character studied his lessons before going out to play games, which he played well, and he was popular, went off to college, became class valedictorian, and had great success in life. Jones, on the other hand, did not study and played poorly. He was not well liked and was a failure. After he finished reading the story, Woodson decided, quote, I'm going to be Charles Bullard, unquote, and set his sights on college. Woodson was an excellent student when he showed up for school, and he said he often completed assignments early. With nothing but time on his hands, he said he became a cut-up in class. Sometimes so disruptive, he was whipped by school officials, followed by another round of whippings at home by his father. By the few accounts available, Woodson was an obedient, dutiful son, possibly his mother's favorite child. The Woodson family returned to Huntington in 1893 on the recommendation of Robert, Carter's older brother, who reported in glowing terms on the prosperity that awaited them in this part of West Virginia. Before joining the family, however, Carter said he and Robert completed jobs building the railroad from Thurman to Loup Creek and working in the coal fields in Fayette County, West Virginia. At age 20, Dr. Woodson enrolled in 1895 at Huntington's Douglas School and was frequently absent because he was off working. But he said he studied Virgil and Caesar on his own. He tested well and received a diploma after about a year of a 2-year program in a graduating class of 2. Trent R. Jenkins was Woodson's only classmate, who graduated with him in 1896 during Douglas School's commencement at Davis Theater in Huntington. We know little about Jenkins, but wouldn't it be nice to know what happened to him, his family, of what he thought of the father of black history during those early years when Dr. Woodson was just, quote, the young precocious Carter Woodson, unquote, among the last few times anyone outside his immediate family called him by his first name? After receiving his diploma, Dr. Woodson studied at Berea College in Kentucky and briefly at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania before moving to Fayette County, West Virginia, and teaching high school in Winona. He served as a Sunday school teacher, and president of the Board of Deacons of the First Baptist Church in Winona. In 1900, Carter H. Barnett, a Woodson first cousin, was fired as principal of Douglas High School because of his politics. The West Virginia Spokesman, a newspaper Barnett edited, supported independent black politics rather than party lines, as did Woodson when he discussed politics in Washington long after he departed Huntington. And the cousins shared a bold, combative style. Barnett promoted his own slate of local candidates, which included Woodson's brother, Robert. The episode played out several weeks in the Huntington Advertiser and ended up with Carter Barnett being fired. And I know Karen Nance's here, our school board member. You know, I could see her, just imagining her having a member, the high school principal, also being editor of the paper and running a slate of candidates. While principal, Woodson earned a West Virginia teaching certificate with an average score of 91 and gained recognition in the local press when he honored William McKinley in a special service at Douglas following the president's assassination in 1901. He sketched McKinley's biography and suggested singing "Nearer My God to Thee." In a private life, Woodson continued to read aloud to his father and was said to bring breakfast to him at his railroad job on Sundays. Woodson completed the 2-year degree at Berea in 1903 and sailed on the Corea from San Francisco on November 18, 1903. Few people other than Woodson himself could have imagined his final destination. He traveled the world, became fluent in Spanish and French, and received a second doctorate by an African American at Harvard. He is believed to be the only offspring of former slaves anywhere to earn a doctorate in history. He taught school for 10 years in Washington, a position he left to become dean at Howard. Then he served a stint as dean of West Virginia Collegiate Institute, which is now West Virginia State University, where he wrote the history of black education in West Virginia. Woodson was a highly sought speaker, but in 1933, he managed to deliver a commencement address at Booker T. Washington High School in Ashland and the Douglas School in Huntington. We never hear anyone around here talk about Booker T. Washington High School in Ashland, so I never knew it existed until a couple of years ago. Woodson's commencement address in Huntington and Ashland expressed concerns about an inferior education system and fears that college graduates would not fully apply their training after graduation. Isn't it amazing how some issues just don't go away? Woodson said many graduates were unprepared for the real world. Like Booker T. Washington, he believed you should get all the education you can, but get some you can use. The commencement addresses, strikingly, resembled many of the themes covered in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, which also went on sale in 1933 and now has more than 500,000 copies in print. In Ashland and Huntington, he explained his belief that African Americans should make the most of their circumstances and that teachers should care about their students. Quote, "I am not an advocate of segregation. I do not believe in separate schools. I am merely emphasizing the necessity for common sense schools and teachers who understand and continue in sympathy with those whom they instruct," unquote. Expansion of his History Week into History Month, 50 years after he created the week and more than a quarter century following his death, was a tribute to his legacy. However, Woodson clearly wanted year-round observance of Black achievements, and the separate set-aside for the observances was supposed to be temporary until African American contributions were returned to the history books. It was widely believed during Dr. Woodson's time that Black historiography falls into two divisions, before Woodson and after Woodson. Jacqueline Goggin, a Woodson biographer, has argued that Woodson's attempts to correct the historical record using census data, marriage registers, birth and death certificates, letters, diaries, and oral histories has forced other historians to rediscover the methods and works of Woodson and his associates. Historian John Hope Franklin, who was a Woodson disciple and who today is probably better known than Woodson, concluded that, quote, "For the first time in the history of the United States, there is a striking resemblance between what historians are writing and what has actually happened in the history of the American Negro." As I pointed out earlier, Dr. Woodson was not motivated by accumulations of wealth, and he was critical of others, especially ministers, who claimed to serve members of the public while ripping them off and leaving large estates for their relatives. He was not poor, he lived frugally, earning enough to support his sister in Huntington, pay tuition for relatives, and visit Paris and London for research. His will, written in the 1930s, left almost everything he owned to the History Association he founded. Even the home his widowed sister lived in Huntington for the benefit of people who want to collect and preserve history. Woodson was fond of telling friends that his move from his birthplace in Virginia to West Virginia had been a turning point in his career. If you allow me, I will revise Dr. Woodson's statement and say that Dr. Woodson's departure from Huntington, considering what he accomplished after departing, was a turning point in Black history. Dr. Woodson, despite his great achievements, feared being forgotten and that his promotion of Black history might not survive. His will stipulated that the Journal of Negro History, now the Journal of African American History, carry this phrase, founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Perhaps he was onto something. He was almost forgotten in Huntington. We can put our stamp on our Woodson project, as Dr. Woodson did so ably for American history and culture. The mayor, Alan Gould, Woodson Memorial Foundation, and other supporters of Remembering Dr. Carter G. Woodson have laid the groundwork for keeping Woodson and Huntington connected? Keep in touch with us by visiting marshall.edu/Drinko/Woodson. As I close, I propose a new bumper sticker. Dr. Carter G. Woodson lived here. Or how about a t-shirt that reads, "Never forget CGW." Just thought I'd ask. Good night. Good luck.